Hi, my name is Lydia, and I like The Simpsons.
Well, duh.
It was my favourite show as a kid. I'd rush home after school, remote firmly in my hand, and from 6 p.m, I made damn well sure the channel didn't turn over from BBC Two, even condemning myself and my siblings to the weakest link and Anne Robinson's cheeky wink. So imagine my excitement when shopping with my mum one day and spotted the Simpsons comic. This was mind-blowing. You mean I can read about the Simpsons as well as watching them on TV? And so after a little begging, my mum bought me a copy and I reread that very issue, front to back, back to front. And I wasn't the only one either. The Simpsons comics were huge in the 90s and early 2000s, but sadly if you visit your local magazine rack today in the US, you'll find the Simpsons comic strangely absent. So, how did this beloved comic series come to be one of the most popular in the world? And what may have affected its downfall? Well, stick around as we explore the complete history of the Simpsons comics. Long before The Simpsons was a household name, Matt Groening was a struggling cartoonist who wrote a comic strip called Life in Hell. This comic blurred the lines between adult entertainment with fun characters that could also entertain the masses. And so it landed on the lap of Hollywood director James L. Brooks, who loved it so much he wanted to adapt it into its very own series of shorts for the Tracey Ullman Show on Fox. But Matt Groening didn't want to lose the ownership of these characters, so he hastily drafted up the Simpsons family, who were loosely based on his family, on the day of the meeting. But luckily, Brooks still loved the pitch and gave the show the green light. Therefore, the first Simpsons short, titled Good Night, was first broadcasted in 1987. The animation is pretty crude by today's standards, but you have to realize that this was produced on a shoestring budget. Nonetheless, there was a charm to them and the characters were certainly memorable. I mean, come on, they were freaking yellow. The Simpsons quickly overshadowed the Tracey Ullman Show and became so popular they spun off into their very own primetime show. The pilot episode, Simpsons Roasting on an Open Fire, premiered in 1989, and Simpsons Mania swept across the globe. But I know you're not here to listen to me talk about the television show. You want to know about the history of the Simpsons comics, don't you? Well, Mr. Groening was not only a talented cartoonist, but also a shrewd businessman, and while negotiating with Fox, he asked for the publishing rights to the show. And not realizing what they had in their hands at the time, they foolishly agreed. A mistake Fox would eventually come to regret when the show exploded in popularity. And so in 1991, Matt along with Steve and Cindy Vance launched Simpsons Illustrated. To help better explain what this magazine was, I asked my friend Warren, who is an expert on all things Simpsons. He hosts the popular podcast called Simpsons is Greater Than and also owns the brilliant Instagram account Bart of Darkness and has the greatest merch collection in the entire world.
They were doing Simpsons Illustrated, which was where the comics started, and it was just little comic strips. You know, Simpsons Illustrated would have interviews with people from the show. It would have, letters from fans, all this different stuff. It was one of the only places you could see images of cast behind the scenes, or it was just a really cool magazine. But they did these little comic strips, and those got really popular sort of early into that. And they started tossing around the idea of like, hey, what if we just did comics? What if we just did a Simpsons comic?
These comic strips were written and drawn by talented artist Bill Morrison, and Bill kindly sat down for an interview with us, and we got the chance to ask him all about working at Bongo.
So the comics quickly started expanding to, 2 or 3 pages and then 5 pages and ultimately, 10 or 12. By the time we got to the second annual, we were really used to doing comics and actually having more fun with the comics than any other part of the magazine.
The popularity of the comics led to them creating an all-comics issue called Simpsons Comics and Stories. Their sales were so good, it led to them co-founding Bongo Comics in 1993, with Steve Vance as editor and main writer, Cindy Vance as co-writer and colour and lettering designer, and Bill serving as art director. When Bill wrote his own stories, he also designed his own layouts, pencils, and inks. So when Steve and Cindy left after the first year, Bill took over as editor-in-chief. Matt created the publishing company with the aim to create comics that were a bit more fun, an element he thought was lacking around that time. With that, in 1993, the company launched 4 titles: Bartman, Itchy and Scratchy, Radioactive Man, and of course, the Simpsons Comic. The first issue saw Homer getting zapped by Mr. Burns and turning into a colossal giant. And just like Homer's newly zapped Bart, it was huge.
No! The bee bit my bottom! No, my bottom's big!
175,000 copies were printed, and it became one of the highest selling comics in its debut month, also collecting an Eisner Award for the amazing colossal Homer. The first few issues were released a couple of months apart, until issue number 12 when they became a monthly release. It took a whole team of passionate writers and artists to create the comics, so many that I couldn't possibly name them all in this video. Ian Boothby in particular was hugely influential in making the comics, writing more issues than any other individual. Instead of going the easy route by reusing and adapting old episodes into comic stories, Bill and his team created their very own original storylines.
I was always very interested in making sure that the comics were so close to the show that people accepted them as part of that continuity. So we paid very close attention to changes in the show, or, if a character died, like Maud Flanders, or if they retired a character like Lionel Hutz. When characters would disappear on the show, we would make sure that as soon as possible they would disappear in the comics as well.
Another example of Bill sticking close to the continuity of the show was when Lisa became a vegetarian, making sure she was never shown to be eating meat ever in the comics. He wants to create a seamless transition from screen to page, so that when you read the comics, you felt like you were watching the show. This not only invited new fans who were exposed to the show through the comics, but also appeased fans who religiously watched the show on TV, who probably didn't want to read a repeated storyline. Bill did his job so well that he recalls fans getting confused between issues of the comics and actual episodes in the show.
Every so often people would come up and they would start talking about an issue of the comic book as one of their favorite episodes, not realizing that they were not talking about a TV show episode, but a comic book. So in their head, they were getting it mixed up. I thought that was like the best compliment I could get.
This truly was. The comic didn't have the help from the talented voice actors or musical scores to bring the stories to life. So to awaken the excitement through the pure medium of print was a true talent. And although Matt Groening gave the mandate to Bill that the comic should be as close to the show as possible, he also realized that you can do a whole lot of other things in comics that you couldn't do on TV.
So there was that mandate from Matt to make them as close as possible to the show, but also with the idea that, we're doing a comic book, take advantage of the strengths of the comic book form and do things in the comics that you might not be able to do on the TV show.
The comics allow the writers to put the characters in outlandish scenarios that they couldn't do on TV. Like in issue 8, where the Simpsons are shrunk down and inserted into the body of Mr. Burns. A plot we could only really imagine happening in Treehouse of Horror. There are now hundreds of issues of the comics, but some notable ones that stand out to me include the huge three-parter When Bongos Collide in issue 5, in which we see the Simpsons come face to face with Bartman, Itch and Scratchy, and Kang and Kodos. It's ridiculously fun and a story you'll never see in the show, outside of Halloween specials of course. Aside from these more fantastical storylines, the comics also dealt with deeper topics too, such as free speech and ownership. The story Give Me Merchandising or Give Me Death in issue 13 saw Bart and Milhouse create their very own comic called Oyster Man. When they present their work to industry pros, they are instantly beaten down and told their work sucks, only for the corporate snakes to steal their idea and reap in billions of profits. The company then hires and severely underpays the boys, and it's a really good story that's just as relevant today with creators of every industry. One of the many reasons why the comics were so popular was that they allowed fans to keep up with their favourite yellow family in between weekly television episodes, or even when the show went into hiatus over the summer.
A lot of people would tell me over the years, a lot of fans would say, I love the Bongo Comics because when the Simpsons are on hiatus, like over the summer, when there's no new episodes, I can always go to my Bongo Comics and get new stories.
Radioactive Man. Aside from the main Simpsons comics, Bongo released many other tie-ins. As I mentioned before, Bartman and Itch and Scratchy also debuted in 1993, but one of the most popular titles that came out that year was Radioactive Man #1.
Wow, Radioactive Man #1.
Being that Radioactive Man was a comic book superhero within the realm of The Simpsons, it made perfect sense to translate his existence into his very own real comic series. The Radioactive Man miniseries were an ode to the old Marvel comics that Bill grew up reading. They had a unique number order too. Issue 2, released in March 1994, was titled Radioactive Man #88. The third issue was 216, followed by 412, and then 679, before jumping all the way to number 1000. With each issue representing a different era in comic styles. This is just one of the many thoughtful and unique choices that gave the comics their own edge, giving themselves a real sense of identity. Treehouse of Horror. One of the other most popular things that came out of Bongo Comics was the annual Treehouse of Horror issues. Inspired by the Halloween specials of the same name, they were released annually from 1995 all the way to 2017. And quite honestly, I could do a whole video just on the Treehouse of Horror comics alone. Hell, I'm even tempted to do an entire kill count just on the comics, as there's so many gruesome goodness within those blood-soaked pages. The cover art for these Treehouse comics are beautiful. I mean, just take a look at these. I'd frame every single one on my wall, at home, in my office. And guess what? These were created by Bill Morrison himself, who wanted the covers to have a painted look, similarly to how the comics were when he grew up as a kid. Although Matt wanted the comic to match the show as much as possible, the Treehouse comics allowed them to experiment with not only the stories, but different art styles. Bill invited various talented artists to contribute to the Treehouse of Horror comics and encouraged them to draw the Simpsons in their own unique style. This made the Treehouse comics stand out against not only the regular comic, but also the television show too. At the time, Bill wasn't sure how Matt would react seeing his beloved creations drawn in a different style. But surprisingly, Matt ended up loving it.
And everybody loved it, including Matt. And he came into my office and he said, "This is really great. You should do this more. Do this, next year for Treehouse of Horror. Invite other artists to come in and do their own styles." He said, I really love this.
Futurama Crossover. Bongo didn't just focus on The Simpsons. They also released the Futurama Comics from the year 2000 to 2008, based on the hit sci-fi show, also created by Groening. Way before Homer and Bender met in season 26's Simpsons Rama, the two worlds collided in the epic Infinitely Secret. This 2003 two-part crossover is, in my opinion, better than the TV version. The idea came from Bill, who also worked on the Futurama show early on. He was the one who originally pitched that the two shows should collide, and Matt was originally against the idea.
And he said no. Initially he said, no, don't want to do that. And I said, well, okay, but just curious, why? Well, what's the reason? And he said, well, they're not in the same universe. He said, in my mind, Futurama is our universe 1,000 years from now. So it's the real universe. And The Simpsons is a fictional universe. And I was like, okay, I get that.
So Bill, along with writer Ian Boothby, went back to the drawing board, and they came up with a great idea that was inspired by the Futurama episode, The Day the Earth Stood Stupid, in which the invading brain spawn transported Fry and the gang into the books Moby Dick and Pride and Prejudice.
Mr. Brainley. I'm a gigantic brain.
Most ungentlemanlike.
Bill and Ian considered that the Simpsons TV show and comic would be a real thing in Futurama lore, so one of the brain spawn came back and transported the Planet Express crew into a Simpsons comic. That way, it would make sense for them to meet continuity-wise.
And that just sounded, kind of bulletproof. So I took that back to Matt and I pitched it, and he thought for a second. He's just kind of sitting there thinking. I couldn't tell what was going on in his head. And then finally he goes, okay, you can do it.
Basically, it's a super meta comic, and for many at the time, seeing The Simpsons hanging out with Futurama characters was mind-blowing and brilliant. It's a really fun read that many people still bring up to this day. Bongo's one-shots. Bongo released several one-shot comics focusing on individual characters too, with Ralph, Professor Frink, Jimbo Jones, and hell, even Duffman.
Who wants to party?
Being separate from the television show allowed the writers to bring in one-time characters from the show. For example, Dr. Colossus made a few appearances, and even Hank Scorpio popped in for a few issues. This is a character whose only major appearance on TV was in Season 8, You Only Move Twice. But despite being in only one episode, he was an instant fan favourite. And us fans were harking after more Hank. And although the show's writers ignored us, Bongo listened. So Mr. Scorpio ignited our hearts once more, most notably in the issue 243, when he sets his sights on becoming the new mayor of Springfield. The comic literally opens up with him in front of the White House blaring a flamethrower. That's the dude we love. And despite being a super villain, he discloses to Homer that he considers him his very best friend, which is super cute. But unfortunately, only a couple of issues later, Bongo Comics put out its very last, with the final panel being the Simpsons family swimming in a giant chocolate milkshake, which may just be the ending that Homer deserved after all.
What do you say we go out for a round of frosty chocolate milkshakes?
Alrighty.
And while you can still find Simpsons comics sold in some parts of the world like the UK, these are released by Titan Comics and are just reprints of the older stories. Now, there isn't a definite answer as to why Bongo Comics closed, but my theory is that comic sales on the whole had been in a steady decline for years. And with the high costs of paying writers, artists, and printers, it may have just been too much for the team to make it viable. Bill Morrison also speculated that they may not have had enough foreign licenses to keep it going.
Bongo was expensive. We had the highest page rates in the industry. I think because of that, our production costs were really high, but they were offset by all the countries in Europe and South America and Mexico and elsewhere that licensed our comics and translated them into other languages. But the problem was, I think whenever the show was on the air in certain countries, the comics would be popular. But if the show went off the air, the comics would go away. So I think probably by 2018, a lot of those had dried up. Although I think it was still making some money in the US from sales, probably just not enough to justify keeping it going.
However, that was only his guess, as Bill left Bongo a few years previously. So he couldn't say for certain what the root cause was. But whatever the reason behind the closure, after 245 issues of the Simpsons comics, as well as many other offshoots, this comic was no more. But no matter its current status, readers and their fond memories of the comic still live on.
You know, I think they lasted as long as they did because the people that started Bongo really cared about the property. Like they stuck to the continuity of the show as much as was possible. I think there was just a lot of care. The people that did it were fans. They wanted it to look a certain way and feel a certain way. I think when you take a property as beloved as The Simpsons and you tell a totally different set of stories within a comic, if the people making that love the show as much as you do, there's just no way it doesn't sync up.
And so that completes the history of the Simpsons comics. I want to say a huge thank you to Bill Morrison for sitting down and answering my questions. Did you read the Simpsons comics? Let me know in the comments below, and any fun anecdotes that come with it.